So let me introduce the panel. First will be Professor Bruce Yandel, and he's going to talk about how regulations play an integral part in economic life, rewarding those inside the government circle of influence while the rest of us pay the costs. Bruce Yandel is a distinguished adjunct professor of economics at the Mercatus Center. He's the Dean Emeritus of Clemson College of Business and Behavioral Sciences. He was the Executive Director of the Federal Trade Commission, and he served on the President's Council on Wage and Price Stability. It goes by the lovely name of CALPS, and you'll hear a little more about that at lunch. He has authored or edited 14 books and countless articles. Next will be Dr. Jerry Ellig, who will discuss the Mercatus report card, and that's a new project of Mercatus that's looking at the quality and use of regulatory impact analyses. Jerry Ellig is a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center. He is the former deputy director and acting director of the Office of Policy Planning at the Federal Trade Commission, and he is widely published in regulation. Finally, we have the Honorable Ron Cass, and he will discuss briefly how we've opened up the regulatory process, particularly over the last 65 years since the Administrative Procedures Act was created, so that all citizens have access and can participate, but some preferences get weighed much more heavily than others. Ron Cass is the president of Cass & Associates. He is the Dean Emeritus of Boston University, the Boston University School of Law. He's the former Vice Chairman of the U.S. International Trade Commission and the author of more than 100 books and articles. So quite a distinguished group we have here today. So what we're going to do is we're going to start now, and when Senator Warner gets here, if it's okay with you gentlemen, we'll stop and let Senator Warner speak. So I would like to now turn it over to my friend, Bruce Yandel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Richard. I'm pleased to be included in this panel today and delighted to be a part of the conference. But I want to discuss some characteristics of what I call America's regulatory era, and in doing so, connect to Mr. Obama's new regulatory review executive order and what its effect might be on the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, OIRA. The era I address began in 1970. It was then that regulation became highly centralized at the federal level, that newly formed social regulators, such as EPA, joined the older economic regulators, like the Securities and Exchange Commission, to form a new legal environment that ultimately transformed the U.S. from being a code law country, a common law country, to a code law country. The regulatory era formed a new kind of capitalism, what some refer to as regulatory capitalism, and others call state capitalism, where survival and success depend on building fruitful regulatory relationships. Now 40 years and 2.5 million Federal Register pages later, we pause to catch our breath, survey the horizon, and ask if we as a nation can do regulation better. My brief comments include three elements. First, I will talk about the regulatory commons, the resource base on which regulation is produced. Then I will offer some thoughts on how regulation has altered the political economy of the nation. And finally, I will offer a few thoughts that might be considered in conjunction with the new executive order. Inspired by statutes directing action, our multiple regulatory agencies are like sheep with legislative guiding shepherds grazing on a regulatory commons. Fed by growing budgets and expanding duties, the regulators write many rules, and while budgets and congressional directives partially constrain the commons, there's always room for one more bite by the sheep, one more regulation. The regulatory commons parallels its brother, the fiscal commons. Deficits are the inevitable tendency on one, excessive regulation, the tendency on the other. In fact, across the years 1970 through 2009, regulatory agency budgets were fed by deficit dollars. They grew at an annual rate of 5.2% in real terms, while the federal revenue grew at 3% in real terms. What's it like on the regulatory commons? When one puts on a pair of externality-enabling glasses, so that one can see problems more clearly in the economy, one sees endless opportunities to internalize external costs, to solve problems. and maybe even render the world a better place. Whether it be dealing with lead paint scrapings, mandatory inspection of catfish, energy efficiency for refrigerators and furnaces, minimum standards for driver's licenses, diesel engine emissions, advertising over-the-counter drugs, marketing practices of funeral homes, or ridding the market of a noisy hickory-dickory dot-pounding toy. The world is full of unhappy and dangerous situations that need fixing. But with externality glasses, it is much easier to see the flaws than to determine if all people taken together are made better off after the repairs are in place. And who has time to check? As a result, in the post-1970 period, regulations affecting processes, product design, marketing, personnel, finance, manufacturing, began to affect each and every sector of the economy. In a chaotic sense, industries such as autos, food, steel, construction, paper, chemicals, banking were transformed into a kind of public utility, but without the usual regulatory commission to look after them and to capture. On rare occasions over the last 40 years, government analysts made a back-breaking overall industry assessment to describe and analyze the cumulative effects of all federal regulations on a single industry. But most of the time, no one was keeping score. And even more rarely, regulators would conduct retrospective analyses to determine if indeed the regulations that appeared to be so strongly net beneficial at the time they were imposed really turned out that way. And as all of us who have been a part of the regulatory establishment, I was at the Federal Trade Commission, as all of us understand, there is seldom enough agency time to deal with business in the pipeline, let alone engage in the luxury of self-examination. All of the incentives go the other way. The next Federal Register press run is waiting. In a way, the nature of our work as regulators made it far more important to turn out more rules than to inquire about outcomes. Sadly, it's as if no one really cares about outcomes. What we care about are more rules and more paper. That's the product of the regulatory establishment. Recognition of the incentives on the unrationed commons led to institutional inventions like various executive orders. They evolved in a way to establish a gatekeeper and a watchman and required various reviews by executive branch agencies, and sometimes OMB would put pressure on the independent agencies to follow suit. And today we recognize this new executive order, which again is highlighting the important business of looking before we leap. But as this process has continued over these many years, and as we have looked at various kinds of benefit cost analyses and efforts to rein in the process, the economy that we are watching has changed. Years ago, when regulation was young, before we had published those 2.5 million pages of rules, and when we were a lot younger, economists spoke knowingly in tones of certainty about market failure and the need to intervene because of difficulties generated by such things as market power, information asymmetry, failed institutions, unspecified property rights. We talked as though government and regulation were outside the market process, exogenous. And on occasions, regulators would open a window, examine features of the economy, make some efficiency-enhancing adjustments, and then quickly close the window to let the economy operate in a more glorious way. Indeed, we used the word intervention, and we referred sometime to Michael Lance's 1937 Federal Trade Commission statuary metaphor, where a powerful free market horse is being bridled by a benevolent plowman who presumably serves the public interest. But as regulatory windows opened and closed daily, and as agencies pumped out more rules, firms and industries then became intertwined with government. Government was no longer exogenous or outside the market. It was in the marketplace. Government was endogenous. The strong horses and the special interests came seeking the plowman. And while major regulations may have reduced some perceived market failures, they also cartelized industries, and reduced competition. And so as we think about how this political economy has changed, words that we might use to describe and explain what we're doing become obsolete. When banks become tantamount to regulated public utilities with rules at every margin, can we accurately refer to a problem as evidence of market failure? Might we more accurately say government failure or regulatory failure? Well, today we have an intertwined political economy where economic agents, public and private, always connected, interact on the commons. Cutting through the entanglement will be difficult. Each rule worth revising or repealing maintains wealth for members of a regulatory cartel. The horses will turn on the plowman. And so while it is critically important that the executive order call for continued benefit cost analysis, I want to suggest that we need to go include that and go beyond it. To encourage competitiveness, going beyond the traditional benefit cost approach, I suggest first agencies do a potential cartel analysis of every major industrial rule, that they be required to identify winners and losers and account for the gains and losses across industries that may result in a rule-induced cartel. Second, that the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission be engaged in the review of major rules in cooperation with OIRA for an antitrust assessment, and that they act as interveners in regulatory proceedings. Third, in conjunction with the new requirement for retrospective analyses and industry reviews, that Congress annually hold hearings for the purpose of reviewing the related reports with an eye toward improving the competitiveness of the U.S. economy and identifying annually the economic gains obtained through OIRA's regulatory review process. 2.5 million pages of rules later, it is time to sharply revise the way we regulate. Thanks very much.
Well, thanks, Bruce. I think Richard did a heck of a job framing this panel, and I suppose that makes us the drywall guys. Try not to be too dry, though. Well, we have a new executive order on regulation that reaffirms the existing executive order on regulation, directing federal agencies to ask various questions and find various answers before they go ahead and regulate. Well, if we want to talk about regulatory reform, we have to figure out where we are and where we're starting from. And we're starting from a position where federal agencies have been told for decades by presidents via executive order that they must do various types of regulatory analysis, particularly for the really big regulation. And occasionally Congress tells agencies that you must do some type of analysis or you must consider some factor like costs or efficiency. So how well have regulatory agencies been doing the things that presidents and sometimes Congress have been telling them to do for decades? The short answer is overall not that well. The problem is institutional, not political or personal. So don't take my first answer as either a complaint about the people in regulatory agencies or a call for, oh, if we just had a different political party in charge, everything would be fine. And that implies that to improve the quality of regulatory analysis and the regulatory process, what we need fundamentally are institutional reforms that will make sure that good analysis is required, that it's objective, and that it's used. Okay, how did I get to those conclusions? If you try to figure out how well agencies do regulatory analysis today, it turns out there is an existing scholarly literature on this. And typically what researchers have done is either selected several regulations and their impact analysis for a very detailed case study look, or researchers have taken another method where they'll take a subset of certain types of regulations. Often it's been health, safety, environmental regulations, put together a checklist of things that ought to be in the analysis and see whether the agencies did those things. And the results of that literature are not that encouraging. The results, scholars tend to find that on average, regulatory analysis isn't that great. There's wide variation in quality. There are some really good regulatory analyses that have been done over time, but even sometimes pretty elaborate ones have problems in them. Researchers tend to find that quality doesn't vary much from one administration to the next, and that when it comes to actually using the analysis, sometimes agencies will use a regulatory analysis in ways that affects decisions on the margin, and if it's a big regulation, that can be a big effect. But in an awful lot of cases, the agency makes a lot of the decisions it's going to make, then hands the regulation to the economist and says, here, do the regulatory analysis. Now, this is what's in existing literature. A few years ago at the Mercatus Center, Patrick McLaughlin and I asked a question, is this generally true? What if we could look at all of the economically significant regulations for several years and evaluate them according to a common framework and figure out if we include everything, health, safety, environmental, civil rights, budget regulations that implement spending programs, if we evaluate everything, how does it stack up? How do different kinds of regulations to compare? And that was the genesis of the Mercatus Center's, what we now call our regulatory report card. We look at all of the economically significant regulations that have been issued for the past several years. We're looking at these when the regulations are proposed so that hopefully our evaluation of the analysis might be able to have some effect as the regulation is revised and as the regulatory analysis is revised. And we look at two kinds of things. First off, we look at the quality of the analysis. Things like how well does the agency define the outcome that the regulation is supposed to produce and demonstrate that the regulation really will produce that outcome. How well does the regulation define the systemic problem that the regulation is trying to solve? How well does the agency examine a wide variety of alternative ways to solve the problems? What are the costs and what are the benefits of the different alternatives? How well documented is the analysis? How easily could somebody who wanted to replicate it follow the sources and get the data and replicate it? How clear is it? How easy is it even to find it on regulations.gov or otherwise on the internet? Then we also look at the Federal Register notice that proposes the regulation to see to what extent did the regulatory analysis seem to have some sort of effect on the decisions the agency made. At a minimum, we're trying to figure out, did the agency even claim to use the regulatory analysis? We look at, does it look like the regulatory analysis had an effect on the decisions the agency made in the regulation? And did the agency make some type of provision for retrospective analysis of the regulation by establishing some goals and measures and identifying data that could be used to evaluate the quality of the regulation in the future? Well, what are we finding? We found that we've completed evaluating all the economically significant regulations proposed in 2008 and 2009. We're finding the average quality is low. On our scoring criteria, we have 12 criteria, 5 points apiece, with a score between 0 and 5 for each criterion. So maximum possible score is 60 points. The average is about 27 in both 2008 and 2009. There are some good ones, but they're not stellar. The best one we've seen so far earned 48 out of 60 points. And that was the joint regulation proposed by the Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency in 2009 that was the combined corporate average fuel economy and greenhouse gas emission standards for automobiles. We see wide variation in quality. In 2009, I mentioned the best one was 48 points. In 2009, the lowest score was one that earned just 3 points. This was a Department of Energy regulation on loan guarantees for innovative technologies. In 2008, the lowest score a regulation earned was 7 points. This was a Social Security regulation on scheduling administrative law judges. And the fact that both of those regulations are regulations that implement federal spending programs. Sometimes agencies have to issue regulations to implement spending or revenue collection. When they're economically significant, we include them. And I can tell you we found that in general, the programs that implement budget or spending, the regulations that implement budget or spending programs tend to have much lower quality analysis than other types of regulations. We even see variations within the same department. In 2008, for example, in 2008 there was a different corporate average fuel economy regulation proposed by the Department of Transportation. That scored the highest in 2008, 43 points. But in the same year, Department of Transportation had a regulation on integrity management for gas distribution pipelines that only scored 28 points. Similarly, in that year, One of the top scoring regulations was a Department of Labor regulation that was outlining the circumstances under which the providers of individual retirement plans like IRAs and 401ks could also provide us with investment advice, because you get into some weird conflict of interest issues. The regulations are trying to sort that out. That analysis earned a score of 40 points out of 60. At the same time that year, there was a Labor Department regulation on underground refuges and coal mines, only earned 28 points. By the way, I should emphasize, none of these scores indicate whether the authors of the report card think the regulation is a good idea or a bad idea. We're simply evaluating what's the quality of the analysis and what's the evidence that the agency used it somehow. Use of analysis. Yeah, we did find, looking through, at least for 2008 and 2009, agencies claimed that the analysis affected something that looked like a major decision, maybe about a fifth of the time. So for about 4/5 of the economic regulations, we couldn't really find anything in the Federal Register notice where the agency claimed to use the analysis to make decisions. Again, that suggests that an awful lot of the analyses are done, in some cases very well, by economists who've been handed the regulation after the decisions were already made. Now, there are some bright spots. The best performance we saw on individual criteria we look at were things like accessibility and clarity. That might be telling us that the things that are done the best are the things that are the easiest thing to do. Another bright spot we see is it seems to be the case that when Congress in legislation specifically directs agencies to do analysis or to consider some factor like cost or efficiency, that does get done. So when Congress leads, agencies are certainly more than willing to do stuff. And on every criterion where we evaluate these analyses, it seems like a few of the analyses do reasonably well. Nobody does everything well, though. So the knowledge is there. The knowledge is there to do good regulatory analysis spread across the federal government, but seems like the incentives are somehow awry. And so again, that suggests that we have an institutional problem here, not a political problem. But probably the best evidence of that we've seen is when we compare the scores between 2008 and 2009, obviously two different presidential administrations. We find that the average score is about the same. The distribution of scores is about the same. It's sort of a bell curve, a little fatter on the lower end for both years. And if we look at individual criteria scores, there are very few changes from 2008 to 2009. Again, suggesting the issue is the issue is a question of institutions and incentives, not a question of politics and who are the people in charge. So how do we build on the strengths and fix the weaknesses? Well, I think we need reforms that do three things. Reforms that require regulatory analysis legislatively, not just by executive order, applies to independent agencies as well as the executive branch agencies. Reforms that would make analysis more objective, such as a requirement that agencies have to do regulatory analysis before they publish the proposed regulation and put the analysis out for public comment along with all the data and the other underlying information. And then reforms that will at least require agencies to explain how they used the analysis, if not requiring them to use it in certain ways. Now, of course, institutional reforms are difficult. They're never going to be easy. And so I would leave you then with the inspirational words of that great Eastern philosopher, Yogi Berra. If this was easy, it wouldn't be so hard.
Thanks, Jerry. That's good. Thanks.
I want you to notice I went all the way around to my right to get here. I want to thank the Mercatus Center for inviting me. I do have to say, when Richard was describing the panel to us when we had our little pre-call, he said, we're going to start with Bruce, who's going to explain just how bad things are and how scary regulations are. Then we'll go to Jerry, who will tell us how we can measure how bad things are. And then Ron will talk about process. So I'm here to talk about process. I'm going to come at this a little bit sideways. I want to start with a story of a fellow, and you can tell these are all true stories, who was talking to God. And he said, I wanted to get a little perspective here, God. How long is a billion years from your standpoint? And God said, really, it's like a second. And the man said, and how much is $1 billion from your standpoint? And God said, it's like a penny. And the fellow thought for a minute and said, could I have one of your pennies? And God said, sure. Can you wait a second? When we talk about making decisions, it's important to know how we go about making it, what the rules are, what sort of process we use, and what the terms are we're dealing with. If you look at agency regulation, we started out with a fairly simple framework in the Administrative Procedure Act. It was designed by people who were really pragmatic. They were appointed back in the 30s by President Roosevelt after another committee he had appointed came back with recommendations he really didn't like. Congress liked him, passed a bill that he vetoed. But he said, let's see if we can do a little bit better with this, and put a committee together of some of the leading experts on administration at the time. And they came up with a fairly simple model. The agencies do a lot of things. It's very complicated, but we're going to see if we can set a few basic patterns. They'll do things informally. We're not going to tell you anything about that because there's nothing to say. They'll do things that look a lot like what courts do, and we'll give you some pretty clear guidelines about that and about how they ought to go about it. And we'll have some different ways they can get exceptions from it where it simply is not really quite court-like, where it's a little more policy-driven than that. And then there are types of policy-making or decisions that look more like what Congress does, and we're going to give you a little bit of guidance about how they do that. We're not going to say a whole lot. We're going to say they ought to tell you in advance what they're going to do. They ought to provide an opportunity for people to come in and tell them why it's not a good idea to do it that way, how they could improve it, what could be better about it. They ought to respond to what people are saying in a reasonable manner, give some real, thoughtful feedback, but they don't have to say a great deal about it. And then they ought to make clear what it is they're doing. They ought to publish the rule. They ought to make it available so people know what it is. And this is all fairly straightforward stuff. It's stuff that ought to make decision-making better and make it easier for people to comply with it. So what went wrong? Well, part of what went wrong is that you can't take politics out of government. And there is, as has been described by several people already, a demand for different rules. I think Richard may have been the one who mentioned that we have now in the Code of Federal Regulations 226 volumes with more than 160,000 pages. The 10 Commandments. You've got 10 little... People can remember the 10, well, not every president, but most people can remember the 10 Commandments. It's fairly simple. It's fairly intuitive. As you go about leading your life every day, you can keep in mind what you're supposed to do. If you're in business, if you are subject to the federal regulations, I defy anyone, even the amazing Kreskin, to be able to keep in mind all of those 163,000 pages of regulations, or even just the ones that are relevant to your particular business. Not only that, they are written in ways that are designed to defy anyone who is a natural speaker of English. Now, my wife, who is also my law partner, actually has a background in tax law, so she understands this stuff. I pick up the tax code. It looks to me like it's written from the middle out in every direction, in every provision. These are not things that are designed to make life easy, and they're not designed to make our businesses more competitive. When you have rules that are difficult to understand, when you have many of them, when they intersect and overlap and contradict one another, there is no way you can run your business in a sane, thoughtful, and easy manner. And when people talk about competitiveness, think of it like running a race. If you're running a race, it's a lot easier to run the race if you're not carrying somebody on your back. And the bigger and heavier that person gets, the harder it is to run the race. When the person is, metaphorically, 226 volumes at 160-some thousand pages that are written in ways that are indecipherable, you really have an enormous weight to carry as you are trying to be competitive. In my old life, I dealt with international trade. International trade is a spur It's a stick to make people more competitive. It's a wonderful thing to have trade as a way of measuring how competitive you are and of giving you an incentive to be more competitive. And when you find that trade is making you more competitive, what's the natural response? Stop it, so you don't have to be more competitive. Well, we have to find a way not to stop trade, not to stop what it is we're competing with, but to stop adding to the weight of the people who are on our back. How do we go about that? Well, one of the ways we do that is we look at our regulatory framework and we say, this isn't working, so let's fix it. And how are we going to fix it? Well, the first instinct is to fix it by adding more regulation. I mentioned the Administrative Procedure Act, which was passed in 1946. Since then, we have fixed regulation repeatedly. We added the Freedom of Information Act in 1967, the National Environmental Policy Act in 1969, the Federal Advisory Committee Act in 1972, the Government and the Sunshine Act in 1976, the Regulatory Flexibility Act in 1980, the Administrative Dispute Resolution Act in 1990, the Regulatory Negotiation Act in 1990, the Unfunded Mandate Reform Act in 95, the Congressional Review Act in 96, and each one of these layers on new things for agencies to do when they set about the business of regulating. We have recently a new executive order from President Obama, and it's an executive order it is hard to take issue with in the sense that it does what presidents have periodically done over the last 30 years. It says, stop. Look at the impact of what you're doing. Consider the impact of these regulations on the business community. I want people to engage in decision-making, says the executive order, that makes clear what the net benefit is to each regulation. And I want regulations that only are passed if they provide net benefits. That's hard to argue with that. However, what it also says is take account of the following factors. And among the factors you're supposed to take account of are not only ordinary costs and benefits that can be quantified, but also impacts that are hard to quantify, including equity, human dignity, fairness, and distributive impacts. Now, certainly, the President is right. These are all important considerations. And these are all things that have an impact on our society. But if you tell me too many things to keep in mind and too many things to consider, it's a little bit hard for me to make a conclusion. If we're trying to line up a crowd in front of a theater, and we say, how should we line up? Well, we could line up in alphabetical order. We could line up by height. We could line up by age. We could line up in the order in which we arrive. But if you tell me, I'd like you to find a way of lining people up that takes account of people's height, age, weight, the order in which they arrive, their age, hair color, and ethnic background, it's hard to come up with a rule that does all that makes any sense to anyone. At a certain point, we have to stop adding new commands on what people should consider and realize that the only way that we're going to get a set of regulations that works, that pares down what we do, and that is understandable to the people who have to live with them, is to have some sense that we can reduce our ambition on what we're regulating, reduce our willingness to do this by laying on more commands on how to go about it, and to have a sense of modesty in what our project is. And for that, I think most people in government would say, can you wait a second?
Good for you. Good man.
We're going to take a few questions for the panel, and if you'll just announce who you are, raise that hand up here and take the microphone, and keep your questions brief.
Hi, my name's Ben Lesser. Thank you for being here. This is really educational for me. I noticed that no one's made the point that the executive order, in my understanding, excludes independent agencies like the one in which I work, which is the second most prolific generator of regs. I just wanted to make that point. Moving on to my question, what do you think of the idea that somebody from one of the think tanks published a couple of weeks ago that we force agencies, and I guess departments for that matter, that engage now in informal rulemaking to engage in formal rulemaking, which would require, as I understand it, a lot more hearings and transparency and process and slow the regulatory process down?
Got a thought on that? Ron?
Well, I think that more process and slower process are not always good things. I think you really have to look at this in a context in which there are so many things agencies do. Sometimes we really want them to act very quickly. Sometimes we want them to act with great deliberation. Sometimes we want them to take account of an awful lot of science, a lot of what is done at the FDA. We really want neutral science to govern. And sometimes we really want policy decisions. You know, what the FCC does is mainly policy-driven, and we just want the policy to be very good. I do want to take 1 second here to make a plug. Among federal agencies, if you're an important federal agency, you get a big budget, a lot of oversight, and you produce a lot of rules. The Administrative Conference is a small agency that gets very little money, but that actually spends its time looking at how other agencies work and trying to figure out how to make them work better. And so the more we have agencies like that that are taking the process side seriously and trying to improve it, the better off we'll be. I think broader generic fixes are unlikely to work.
Bruce.
Hi, I also work for an independent agency, although the views expressed are my own. I had a question for Jerry, and I was happy to hear that the project that Richard described to me last year of scoring our regulations is moving forward, and we look forward next year in February, right after the Oscars and the Emmys, that maybe you'll be thinking of actually giving an award for the highest scoring reg. One part of your scoring I wanted to pursue a little bit, which is the how seriously or how meaningfully the agency uses the economic or regulatory analysis in its rulemaking. Sounds to me like you're just, as a first approximation, taking the agency's word for it in what they say on the face of the reg. Strikes me that, although that's probably the best you can do right now, it's an approximation that could be full of false positives and false negatives. You might expect somebody who is ignoring the regulation to have a boilerplate statement that simply says, of course we took the we took this very much seriously and into account, and our final rule reflects this analysis, whereas an agency for whom cost-benefit analysis, economic analysis is in fact deeply embedded in every aspect of the rule, and from the front part of the rule and throughout the process, the economists are there, the cost-benefit people are there weighing alternatives. It might be so taken for granted they wouldn't even mention it.
Yeah. Well, I can tell you when we sit down to discuss scoring on those questions where we go through the Federal Register notice looking for evidence that the agency used the regulations, those are the ones that are the hardest for us to figure out. Now we can get some notion of whether the agency did it, more thoroughly or less thoroughly. How strongly did the agency make the claim? If it's just a boilerplate, that usually kind of sticks out. So I guess the answer is I know exactly what you mean about it being difficult. There's going to be a certain amount, maybe more error around our evaluation in those than some of the other questions. On the other hand, when Congress writes a law that tells an agency that it must consider efficiency when it issues the regulations, Department of Energy does this with its energy efficiency regulations, where they have to consider not efficiency, but they have to consider energy savings, but also costs to the businesses and so forth. They at least make an effort at saying, okay, this piece of the analysis deals with this factor Congress told us to consider. This piece of the analysis deals with this factor Congress told us to consider, and here's how we made the decision. And while it's true that you have to take some of those things with a grain of salt, when we're comparing that to other regulations where there's maybe a regulatory impact analysis, no reference to it whatsoever in the Federal Register notice, I'm willing to make a judgment about who did that better and who did that worse.
Rick?
Thank you. Rick Belzer, Regulatory Checkbook. I have a question back to the Obama executive order. There was something in it that when I read it, I missed it. I think a lot of others may have missed it. And in Cass Sunstein's implementation memorandum from a week or so later, there's an elaboration of what might be the most radical process change ever. I can read briefly from the memo. It's about open exchange. As an open exchange refers to a process in which the views and information provided by participants are made public to the extent feasible and before decisions are actually made. Section 2 thus seeks to increase participation in the regulatory process by allowing interested parties the opportunity to react to and benefit from the comments, arguments, and information of others during the rulemaking process itself. And nowhere in the executive order did that come out, but in the implementation memorandum that's there, which is closer to, I think, Susan's wiki proposal. But this is really quite a remarkable, it seems to me a remarkable proposed process change. I'd like to get some reaction to the idea of opening up the comment process so that all of that occurs in a very public way, not under the control of an agency.
I think it does speak to the age we're living in, of course, and the wiki approach certainly seems interesting to me. In years past, it was considered that there were underrepresented groups and organizations, many who are not organized. And in years past, there have been some funding that would come to agencies so that you could help to provide access for those groups in a regulatory proceeding. But this opens it up. I just hope that as it opens up and we do get ideas and new information, that there's a mechanism, a process by which that information does become captured in some way in the decision-making process. In other words, and you didn't suggest this, but it's obviously not an end in itself to say, isn't the world wonderful, because now we're all sitting around the campfire singing kumbaya to each other about a proposed rule, and don't you feel better because you had a chance to sing? What's important is what happens as a result of the content, of course.
Okay, we're going to stop here. You'll get another chance to ask questions during lunch on your cards. We're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to go to the next panel. So see you in 10 minutes.